This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I ask a contributor to provide background and context to a big story in the news. This week, something a little different. The Crown has been a phenomenal success for Netflix and season 4 has just hit our screens. We've now reached the 1980s and events that some of us remember all too well. So how much license does the series take with history? Does it matter more now we're getting that much closer to the present day? Or does it not matter at all? I've been talking to historian Hugo Vickers, and it's fair to say he's no fan. He's even written a book, The Crown Dissected. Spoiler alert, we talk about incidents in the series, including in the season just released. When you first heard there was going to be this kind of series, what was your first reaction? Were you excited? Did you think, oh, that could be interesting? Or did you think, I wonder what that's going to be like?
Well, it's a long time ago, but I seem to remember that the first thing I thought of was I felt very concerned as to what they were going to do. And of course, in that respect, I wasn't disappointed.
Why did you say that?
Because they were fictionalizing the lives of real people. I mean, you see, I wouldn't really mind if this series was a sort of loosely based on real people, like a lot of things are, and they gave them different names. But what they do is they put real people into semi-real situations, and then, of course, they actually twist the facts around to suit the drama. So you get several instances which are really absolutely what they show is totally the opposite to what actually happened. And now you, as an intelligent viewer, could sit back, enjoy it, because after all, it's very well filmed, well acted. They have a good cast, they have good people in it, and it looks splendid. But this, in my view, makes it worse because it's even more convincing. But even so, you could still sit back and say, okay, I enjoyed that as a drama. I realize that it's not true, but I have a horrible feeling that an awful lot of people, but I know for a fact an awful lot of people accept it as gospel. Even documentary makers who come and see me say things like, well, we want to do a discussion about Prince Philip refusing to kneel at the coronation. Well, he didn't, frankly. He couldn't care less. He was perfectly happy to kneel. Do you see what I mean?
But that obviously played into the drama. We'll come back to various incidents, but I just want to sort of start off with portraits, I suppose. Like obviously, the first, the significant portrait is that of the Queen. In many ways, it's not unsympathetic, though, is it? I mean, for me, it portrays somebody who is very concerned about doing her duty for the crown, for the country. So it's not that unsympathetic a portrait. What did you think of it?
I thought that Claire Foy did a very good job portraying the Queen, because she got the Queen's theatrical timing very well, and the sort of the as you can imagine, rather significant silences that the Queen sometimes employs before answering a question or whatever. I don't like the portrayal by Olivia Colman, because I think Olivia Colman has got rather a cheeky face, sort of a toothy smile, if you like, and therefore, in order to avoid that, she's always looking incredibly glum. I mean, she's always got a downturned mouth and looks rather fierce. And I think that at the end of the first two series, you end up rather liking the Queen, and I'm not sure that after the next two, you have the same reaction. That's my opinion.
Do you feel that it is fundamentally sympathetic, though, to the Queen, to the role that she finds herself in?
No, I don't. I don't. I mean, I think there are instances where you can see the sort of things that the Queen had to tackle, but the way they have her reacting and. No, I don't like it.
Can you think of any specific examples of moments where she was reacting and you thought that doesn't ring true to you?
Well, I can actually. In season 4, for example, when the Princess of Wales comes back after the Australian tour and the Queen bites her head off and says that she's been playing to the gallery, the way she talks to Mrs. Thatcher, the way she acts in an unconstitutional manner. The way she, for example, on the first day Mrs. Thatcher comes to see her, you see the Queen speculating about which ministers might be appointed. I mean, it's all very amusing, but I mean, it's totally wrong. I mean, the Queen would never do such a thing. And as for the whole sort of business of Michael Shea, you actually have the Queen saying that for once in her life, she really wants the world to know that she doesn't get on with Mrs. Thatcher. Well, the real Queen makes it her business to get on with her elected prime ministers. And James Callaghan used to say she offers friendliness, if not friendship. And she realizes that she is there by hereditary descent, and she is not elected, and that the prime minister is elected and therefore chosen by the people. It is her duty to work with that person. And I think you'll find that most prime ministers have found the Queen to be a wonderful sounding board and somebody that they can talk to in the complete and happy and safe knowledge that what they say will never go any further. Indeed, just to say, sorry, quickly, that anything we know about the relationship that the Queen has with her prime ministers, I can assure you, comes from the prime ministers, not from the Queen. You know, Wilson told us that she liked him. Blair is always going on about his relationship with the Queen, what she says to him and things. Cameron let her down once or twice. And, you know, Mrs. Thatcher, in her memoirs, states that she always got on very well with the Queen. And, that the press played up the differences because they couldn't resist it, two strong women.
I remember being at a speech once which Tony Blair gave in Los Angeles, actually, where he said at one of their meetings that the Queen had said to him, I was Queen before you were born. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure you're supposed to be passing that sort of stuff on to an audience, but that struck me at the time.
I would have loved to see the look on his face when she gently reminded him of that, wouldn't you?
That's right. And when David Cameron said that she purred down the phone on the news of the Scottish referendum, I know he was very sorry and very chastened after that when it came out.
If I can speculate, I reckon that what would have happened at the next time that David Cameron met the Queen, that he would have come in and started spluttering out his apologies, and she would have sat there in absolute silence and let him go down, 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 and then suddenly said something like, tell me about the trade figures, Prime Minister.
Hugo, you did say there, if I could speculate, I mean, people are going to be listening to this and saying, okay, you say this would not have happened as the way the drama unfolded. How do we know that you, Hugo Vickers, have a better idea of how this would have worked?
Well, I promise you that I have relied entirely on authorized biographies and information which is actually in the public domain for any criticism that I have made over the Crown. If you want to look at the story about Michael Shea, the press secretary who actually acted off his own bat and briefed the Sunday Times and then denied that he'd done it and hid behind a veil of secrecy until eventually he was routed out and they had to get rid of him. I turned to Charles Moore's biography of Margaret Thatcher to find the information about that. I turned to Sally Bedell Smith's biography of the Queen and I find information there. All right, I did also know privately that this was the case because a number of people had told me, but I'm not going to use, as it were, that information to berate the Crown. What I'm using is information which they could and should have consulted to get the true story.
And Michael Shea, that was over comments leaked to a paper about supposedly what the Queen thought about Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, because there was a well-known difference because the Queen, as head of the Commonwealth, was supporting the Commonwealth in sanctions over South Africa, and Mrs. Thatcher was not a great respecter of the Commonwealth. And so that part, you see, is sort of reasonably well played. But after that, I mean, the thought that the Queen would in any sense wish to, denigrate her prime minister while she's in office, by going to the Sunday Times, by instructing her press secretary to go to the Sunday Times and ditch Mrs. Thatcher. No, absolutely not. And Michael Shea talked to them independently. And I mean, he didn't like Mrs. Thatcher. So in a sense, what he was doing was using his position as the Queen's press secretary to get his views across. It caused an enormous furore. And the royal household got rid of him, and they sacked him, but they did it very politely. They got him a job with Hanson PLC. So that's how you do these things.
Okay, well, moving on to portraits of other major figures, Prince Philip obviously features very heavily, especially in the first couple of series. I have to say, I was surprised at in one of the episodes where there's references Anthony Blunt has been exposed, or at least exposed to the royal family as being a spy for the Russians, and he comes back and basically says to Prince Philip, well, what about your involvement with the whole Profumo scandal, Christine Keeler, that kind of thing. I was quite surprised to see that represented in the TV series. What did you think?
Yes, well, I was surprised too. Of course, that never happened, and Anthony Blunt did not live in Buckingham Palace as they tried to sort of pretend that he did, and he was involved with the Queen's pictures, etc. Well, it amused me rather because Stephen Ward had sketched Prince Philip, and that actually had been the frontispiece of the Illustrated London News. He also sketched the late Duke of Gloucester, the late Princess Royal, Archbishop Macarius, and various other people. I don't think that we're suggesting that any of these figures were frolicking around in Lord Astor's swimming pool at Clifton. So it was a very cheap shot, frankly.
And Stephen Ward being the associate of Christine Keeler, who eventually took his own life over the whole scandal.
And he was a well-known osteopath, you see, and so he did meet quite a lot of people in society. He was a good draftsman too. I mean, I've seen a lot of his pictures. They now sell for quite good sums.
So you describe it as a cheap shot in the series?
I do.
Because there's essentially no basis to it, in your view?
Well, there's absolutely no basis whatsoever. But you know, just the fact that if they the Blunt character, if you recall, actually sort of says that there are these pictures by Stephen Ward, and that if they came out, this would reflect very badly on Prince Philip. Well, they'd already been out. They'd been in the Illustrated London News as a frontispiece some months before. I mean, you know, I'm sorry.
Okay, and what about the portrait of Prince Philip? What do you think of the way he's portrayed?
Well, I think he's portrayed extremely unkindly. I mean, Matt Smith plays him as a very cocky kind of Jack the Lad character. And there's absolutely none of the real Prince Philip there at all. I mean, Prince Philip's a highly intelligent, a very organized man who's you know, just like the rest of the royal family, frankly, it puts his duty first, and has come up with some very, you know, he's said some very important things to do. The Queen and Prince Philip are very keen on reconciliation, you know, and you know, the statements that he made about, you know, how we should try to make friends with the Germans again, conciliate with your enemies and so forth. None of that side of Prince Philip emerges at all. So I really didn't like the Matt Smith portrayal. And actually, Matt Smith went on some program, Graham Norton or someone like that, and he said something like, you know, well, what man would want to kneel before his wife? I mean, I completely understand his position. I mean, he seemed to think he understood him very well. He doesn't understand him at all. And actually, the worst thing that they did to Prince Philip was that there was a scene, an episode about Gordonston, and there's a rugger ball and some muddy boots, and then Gordonston came up in the caption of, oh God, here we go. And so, of course, we got the rain falling on Prince Charles's bed and him being persecuted. And so you can see the kind of conversation they will have had back in the office. You know, Prince Philip obviously disliked his son, so he sent him off to Gordonston so he'd have a tough time. We must find a reason why his father hated him to send him to such a school. So they have Prince Philip getting involved in a fight. His half term was cancelled, and he doesn't go to Darmstadt. No fight, no half term cancelled, no him going to Darmstadt anyway. So his sister Cecile, according to the series, flies over to Britain, which she doesn't want to do. Well, actually, she was always coming to a wedding. And then the true bit is that the plane they were traveling in hit a chimney in Ostend in the fog, and she and her two boys, her unborn baby, and her mother-in-law and her husband and various other people were killed. And you then get a scene where Prince Philip goes to the funeral, and his father actually sees him for the first time and says, it's because of you, boy, that we're burying my favorite child. Well, no, it did not happen. And actually, Prince Philip and his father traveled out to Darmstadt together, which must have been a desperate journey. And here, okay, I'll contradict myself. I mean, I worked on a book about Prince Philip's mother. His archivist said to me the first time I met her, one thing you should know about Prince Philip is that the worst thing that ever happened to him was the death of his sister. And he was called into his headmaster's study, and he minded even more because she was pregnant at the time. Now, how they can make that into a drama, you know, which is all totally untrue, and blame Prince Philip, I mean, that's absolutely monstrous.
It's interesting that you feel that was one of the worst things that's been done in the series. Because I was going to say a lot of the sort of the most poignant or difficult things are what happens more recently, because maybe they're in people's, more people's direct experience. But for you, that, even though that's a more historic event, that's one of the worst.
Well, what I'm hearing, of course, is that people are now saying about the present series, well, we remember that and we know this didn't happen and that didn't happen. Well, I'm a historian, I've been studying all this all my life. And so I can go right back to the early part and I can find fault with that too. And there's a very strange thing which has happened with this thing. So people didn't much like series 1, but when series 2 came out, they said, oh, series 1 was fine, but series 2 really is awful. Then when series 3 came out, they said, well, 1 and 2 were pretty good, but this is dreadful. And now they say the same thing. Series 4 is absolutely awful, but the first 3 were really not so bad.
Well, I mean, this is maybe the important part, isn't it? That the closer we get to contemporary events, maybe the more significant it is that, the way that the drama is presented, because these events are closer to us, more people remember them, but they may still shape things that are still part of our current lives. I mean, we now have the investigation into the Princess Diana interview, for instance, going on within the BBC as to how that happened. So I guess, are you concerned that the closer we get with the series to contemporary times, potentially the more insidious it could be?
Yes, I would agree with that, but I don't wish to lose my original position of saying that steady on, some of the early part was pretty bad as well. But you're quite right, of course, people do remember things, and we're talking now about almost all the people are alive in the present series, and so it is much more difficult. And the whole relationship between the Waleses and Camilla Parker Bowles and all that, that's all, these people are still very much part of our lives.
Are there instances in this present series which you can point to and say, absolutely not, we know that didn't happen?
Well, I don't think for 1 minute that Mrs. Thatcher, well, just to explain that the Geoffrey Howe speech, fine. The ministers coming in to see her. This is 1990 when there's a leadership crisis challenge to her. The ministers coming in and saying, yes, of course I support you, Prime Minister, but the backbenchers are a little bit sticky on this. Dennis saying, calling them bastards and murderers, but basically telling her that the game's up. And then suddenly Mrs. Thatcher says, I have a card up my sleeve, and goes to see the Queen and asks her to dissolve Parliament and call a general election in order to save her skin. Excuse me.
That definitely didn't happen.
Well, of course it didn't happen, and nor would it have happened. It couldn't possibly have happened. Absolutely not. And I really seriously think that if people are studying Mrs. Thatcher for exams, that history examiners ought to have a Crown crib sheet somewhere to see where some of this information that will be sort of creeping into people's psyches, and they believe it to be true. You see, they say, oh well, that obviously happened, because we saw it in the Crown.
Well, do you think that's the case? I mean, let's just step back a bit and just say, this is drama, this is actors, these are people portraying characters. I think I was listening to Gillian Anderson actually last night, and she said something like, creative license is always employed to some degree. Gillian Anderson, who plays Margaret Thatcher, creative license is always employed to some degree in situations like this. I mean, that's the case, isn't it?
Creative license, and when Peter Morgan talks about conflating incidents and things, I understand all that. In order to make a drama, you have to, you can't, for example, the thing which he's gone on about Mountbatten. No, Mountbatten did not write a letter to Prince Charles on the morning that he was blown up, but he did write similar letters. And I can quite see that if you're creating a drama, you're not going to have him at Broadlands writing a letter and then flying out to Ireland and then going off on his boat, etc. I mean, I can sort of see how you might conflate that. I mean, it's a bit sick, but nevertheless, I understand that. But I think that fiction should be used to help us to understand the truth, not to pervert the facts and twist it round so that you get a completely contrary view. That's what I'm worried about.
I suppose I can't speak for Peter Morgan, but I guess he would say, I am using fiction to arrive at a truth, and maybe some of the facts get changed, and that his fiction, his truth would be his view of the relationship between Prince Philip and Prince Charles, for instance, and therefore you do change some incidents because that helps you arrive at the truth of that relationship as he would see it.
Well, let's go back to Mrs. Thatcher and and Michael Shea. I mean, is it fair for him to, when we know that the true story is that Michael Shea independently briefed the Sunday Times, is it fair to have the Queen saying, "I'm going to break away from everything I've always done in the last 34 years of my reign and brief against my Prime Minister. I want people to know that I'm not getting on with her." And Michael Shea is presented as a saint. He says, "I can't possibly do this." And he asks the private secretary to put it on record that he's disturbed by this breach from the constitutional ways that the Queen normally employs, and off he goes. And the next day is Prince Andrew's wedding, and you have all the royal children saying, "God, she's lost her, but more or less she's lost her marbles. What's going on? Is that fair?"
Do you think this is actually potentially dangerous, if dangerous is not too strong a word, or damaging, or is it just, look, everybody can understand that this is a drama and it's just a bit of fun?
Well, I wish everybody would understand that it was a drama and just a bit of fun. I would relax considerably. I think there are two things. I think that the good side of The Crown is that, particularly in the early episodes, the youngsters of today realized that the Queen and Prince Philip were once young and had to face all sorts of dramas of one sort and another, whether they're played out correctly or not. Also, certainly speaking from point of view of my own children, I like to think I have intelligent children, and they ask lots of questions and they get more interested in the whole thing, and they will take the trouble to try and find out what really happened. And one of the reasons I wrote my little book, The Crown Dissected, is actually, even if you thoroughly enjoying The Crown, I've gone to the trouble to tell you what really did happen as opposed to what didn't happen. So it's quite a useful guide. But equally, my daughter used to ring me up and say, "Well, did Princess Margaret marry Townsend?" She didn't know. How could she know? She was only 16 at the time, but now she does. So maybe that's the good side. But I think there is a bad side, because I think if you watch season 4, at the end of it, and I've watched it all the way through twice, and I flicked around a bit for a third time, I think you end up rather disliking the royal family, and the only person who seems to come out of the present series well is Diana herself. I don't think even Mrs. Thatcher comes out of it particularly well. I mean, Gillian Anderson plays Mrs. Thatcher with that one monotone voice, the way she used to speak sometimes. She had that way of talking, and that was one of the voices that she used. But she didn't speak like that the whole time. And also she's sort of haranguing the Queen. Well, Mrs. Thatcher was actually always rather nervous of the Queen and rather stuck to the business in hand. So, the way they portray that relationship is wrong.
With the royal family, for the most part, they have very limited ability to come back, contradict, and to sort of put their side of the case. I mean, would you rather that dramas like this simply didn't happen, or maybe that the film The Queen with Helen Mirren simply didn't get made because that you're portraying real people who simply cannot answer back?
I think one of the problems of the series is that, we've gone through 40 episodes now, so they're having to pick away at a lot of all sorts of obscure dramas and things. The Queen film, although in many ways wrong in detail, somehow a sort of actually in essence came through. And I think that probably did help people to understand what the Queen was going through at Balmoral. Because, I mean, if you remember at the time when Diana was killed, I mean, certainly I was stuck in TV studios a lot. You couldn't say a good word for the Queen and the royal family during that week. Nobody would listen to the idea that she was up at Balmoral actually looking after her grandchildren who just lost their mother. I think we've got that point now, but that took a little while to do. And funnily enough, I think the Queen film helped with that. And I don't mind things like Edward and Mrs. Simpson, which, although there might be some differences, may not be totally factually accurate. Do you remember the Edward Fox series some years ago? Was very interesting. But this seems to be sort of, I don't know. No, I think I would prefer that it wasn't being made, to be quite honest, to answer your question.
I mean, it does sound like you feel that it is possible, in some of the other examples you've given, through drama to arrive at a kind of essence, which I guess is the Peter Morgan argument we mentioned before, which is, okay, there may be some of the facts in slightly the wrong place, or some things are not quite as they were, but we're still getting to the real nub of the truth about this story.
But yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head. The details can be played around with a little bit as long as we arrive at the truth, but we're not arriving at the truth. What we're arriving very often is the absolute opposite of the truth. That's what I don't like. And so therefore I think there's an agenda to, and the conclusion that I come to watching season 4 is that the monarchy, the crown, the royal family will do absolutely crush anyone who steps out of line in order to survive. I mean, that's all they care about. So, you know, they've used Princess Margaret and Helena Bonham Carter very much as this wounded beast, you know, who's always giving that message the whole time, because evidently she wasn't allowed to marry Peter Townsend. That's absolutely not true. She decided not to marry Peter Townsend. She could have married him if she'd wanted to. Queen certainly didn't stop her, and nor was the relationship between the Queen and Princess Margaret damaged in any way at all by the Townsend thing. They were as close as anything till the day Princess Margaret died. So, you know, that's what I find tricky.
Isn't there an essence of truth, though, again, that, I mean, the crown is an institution which in many ways is bigger than the individuals who happen to be alive and representing it at the time?
To some extent. I think certainly going back to the abdication, which I've studied very closely, there was a moment when the courtiers, the private secretaries, changed their allegiance from Edward VIII, the man, to the crown, and it helped to ensure a smooth transition from one sovereign to another. And actually, to be fair to him, Edward VIII was part of that as well. Afterwards, he behaved very badly, but at the time, he abdicated actually pretty honourably, if you can abdicate honourably.
So isn't it necessary sometimes for the institution, I don't know whether crush is the right word, but to make sure that other individuals do not threaten, you know, the survival and the integrity of that institution of the crown? Well,
I think that I hear what you're saying, but we have various dramas going on in real life just at this moment. I'm thinking particularly of Prince Harry. The most successful members of the royal family are the ones who quietly support the Queen, because the Queen has a huge amount of responsibility. She's asked to do a lot of things. She can't do everything that she's asked to, and she is quietly supported by other members of her family. That's why we have a royal family, and you know, most of them do a pretty good job, and most of them actually do things very quietly without drawing attention to themselves. Where you get a problem sometimes, I think, is, and we didn't see that in the present series, is people like the Princess of Wales, who appear to be competing with the Queen and sort of becoming a sort of big figure in her own right. And certainly the whole sort of Prince Harry, Meghan thing is obviously a disaster. So I do think that, you know, I think that the Queen needs lots of support, and I think most of them understand that. I mean, look at the way people like the Wessexes, you know, plod around hospitals, and they do lots of very good things, very, very quietly on her behalf.
Just a final thought, you mentioned Meghan and Harry. Could you imagine the Crown taking that whole episode on?
Well, as far as we know, the Crown are going to stop around about 2002, and the sooner they get there, the better. And they apparently got 2 more series coming. Peter Morgan himself said that he thought that the present day dramas were too sort of raw and too sort of ongoing, I suppose, for him to deal with. But who knows? I mean, they said they were going to stop now, but I mean, they're obviously going to go on. You may remember that at the very end, I'm sure you've seen the whole of season 4, presumably, haven't you?
Not the whole lot.
Okay, well, I have, and it ends with a scene with Prince Philip in a bedroom in Sandringham talking to the Princess of Wales. At one point, he advises her not to break away from the system, and he says it'll end badly for you. And she says, "I hope that's not a threat, sir." And so I can imagine that probably somebody will be cooking up a scene where maybe the very murderous looking Prince Charles, as he is in this series, will be conspiring with Prince Philip to have her done away with in a tunnel. And I think that would be pretty sick if they do that, but who knows? They've gone so far out of the way of truth that anything is possible, I'm afraid.
Did you enjoy watching the series at all, any of them?
Let me try and be absolutely honest with you. It's visually a very pleasant thing to watch. And am I allowed to say this? I actually kind of rather enjoy hating it. I'm sitting there looking for mistakes, and I'm very pleased if I find them, and they come thick and fast. So there's plenty for me to get my teeth into, down to the Queen wearing the wrong uniform, even in the trailer. I mean, they open with a howler. She's dressed as a Grenadier Guard with a garter ribbon. And if they bothered to get their details right with their massive budget, she was a Scots Guard wearing a thistle green ribbon that day. They could easily have done that, got that right. So I quite like finding mistakes.
Hugo Vickers, thank you very much indeed for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here about the series of The Crown. Thanks very much. Hugo Vickers, with his views on the series he loves to hate. I suppose that's a recommendation of a kind. I've certainly enjoyed it. All the seasons of The Crown are now available on Netflix. Hugo Vickers' book, The Crown Dissected, is available from Amazon, and there's an updated version on ebooks. If you've enjoyed this podcast or have ideas for others, email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.